In this video, we're going to look at brass writing, and more specifically, brass writing tips. And as with the strings, one of the most common issues I see and hear are that people are just limiting themselves to maybe a couple of articulations. Either they're just writing legato lines or staccato lines. And that is just like the tip of the iceberg of what like brass instrumentalists can do, because we need to remember again that the libraries we're using are just representations of the real musicians and orchestras that are actually playing these instruments. And there's so many ways to play a brass instrument, and there's so many types of expressions you can get out of one. So you're kind of just really missing out and wasting a lot of the potential by just using a couple of articulations. So the first tip again is get familiar with the different kind of articulations you can get out of a brass instrument. For example, you have a mix of short articulations and different crescendos. And clusters like that. All these things are going to, give your tracks a different kind of feel. And some of these crescendos you can use to ramp up tension in action scenes or use them almost as risers into the next section or beat in your tracks. You also have all these different types of short articulations. And using a mix of those is going to give you way more realistic results, just as with the strings. And you have different variations of the sustains here. This is from Arc 4, by the way. So I'd recommend playing around with all the different articulations. This is just from the trumpets. Let's get something else here as well. Go down to Arc 4. Let's go for the horn and... So here as well we have some of my favorites, which are rips. These are all different articulations that you can experiment with and use in your tracks in different ways. Even the different short articulations have a different feel to it. So using and combining these ones are going to give you a much more realistic result. So combine all these things and you're going to get a way more realistic and interesting result. It's going to get way more fun as well to start orchestrating and exploring these different things than just limiting yourself to a few common articulations. Now, the next issue I see a lot is that people forget that these are real instrumentalists playing. So what I mean by that is they just write long lines like this. And anyone who either plays a brass instrument or are familiar with how they actually sound when played live realize that no one can play that because you need to breathe. So you need to, in order to create a realistic brass arrangement, you need to account for the fact that they're actually using their breath to generate the sound of their instrument. So that you will have to make phrases and breaks for them to actually catch a breath. So a more realistic phrase could be something like... stuff like that. The breaks don't have to be like necessarily that long because people can, catch a breath quite fast. But one way to kind of train yourself or a little exercise to make this more natural is to actually hold your breath or breathe out while you're playing. And when you need to breathe, you kind of know that the instrumentalist would have to breathe as well. So that's another tip I would like you to keep in mind. Make sure that brass instrumentalist or the virtual instrumentalist in your arrangement has the ability to breathe. It's going to make it sound way more human, and it's also going to make you think more about the phrasing. So you're not just like playing lines that's just going all over the place. You're thinking more about the actual lyrical phrasing of it. Stuff like that. So that is another tip. Now, another little thing I want to touch on is that a lot of people are using brass in a very one-dimensional way. And what I mean by that is only using it for, very heavy accents like this. Or, big kind of Brahms like this. And not really realizing that these horns play also very soft chords. So experimenting with the softer side of brass is also very rewarding and fun because they have a really warm, lush sound. So here we have this patch called Air. Which is literally blowing air through the instrument. And these articulations make you think about that these are actual instrumentalist playing. So they can do whatever they want with these instruments. And some libraries are utilizing this, others not as much and focusing on the main articulations. But whatever you have at your disposal, play around with all the different ways you can express yourself through these instruments. So depending on which libraries you have, there might be more options for you than you would have realized to play with the different sides of brass that's not necessarily super loud and super intense. So I recommend that you, even if there's just a normal sustain patch, like what I did before with just a patch from Nucleus from Audio Imperia, play around with the different expressions of brass instruments, also on the softer side. Because sometimes you can actually, layer it with strings or choirs and get some really beautiful thickening effect. All right, let's move over to the final tip or mistake or problem area, you can call it, that I see. And that is simply using brass too much or kind of overusing it, especially when you use it in a very powerful way. So let's look at some examples of where I've used brass more sparingly. All right, here I got the demo that I did for Nucleus by Audio Imperia, which is one of the libraries I'm using the most in this new update for the course. Now, when I'm playing through this, I want you to just pay attention to the way I've been using the brass. we start quite quiet, and then we have a crescendo over here where the brass comes in, and then I just take out all the brass except for a little part of a solo horn here. Then I save most of the brass, especially the trombones and everything, until the very end. I only use the brass for the big crescendos. Otherwise, I just have a little mellow solo horn. So a common issue that I see a lot of times is that people use the brass and kind of waste the power of it too early, because when you introduce the brass, which is the loudest section of the orchestra, there's only so much further you can go from there, because you've kind of used all the power you have. So just one simple way to increase the power of the brass is to delay using it, or use it so sparingly that when you do use it, it really makes a big difference. Again, as you can see, this is the only part where I've used all the brass instruments at the very end, and that's 1 minute and 30 in. And the track is less than 2 minutes long, so it's at the very end, and it's making the climax seem way bigger than, it really would if I'd used all the brass from, say, around here. Let's listen to the ending again. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. Try to use the brass instruments quite sparingly, because when you use them, they're going to bring a lot of power, but it can also be abused or overused, which is going to diminish the effect it has. So those are some of the tips I have for writing with brass instruments, like general guidelines I want you to keep in mind when you're writing and when you're orchestrating, and especially when you're mocking up and recording your musical ideas. So let's recap quickly. Get familiar with the different articulations you have for the brass instruments. Not only staccato, legato, sustain, and such, but the different types of staccatos, the different ways that someone can play a short articulations on a brass instrument. The different rips, crescendos, and bends and things like that you can get out of them, but also the softer side of the brass instrument. How they can be taken all the way down and create beautiful harmonic beds, for example, not only super loud and aggressive parts. And the final thing I want you to remember is to use them sparingly, because they can be extremely loud, and everything works by contrast. The loudest parts only seem loud if there's any quiet parts to compare them to. And of course, make sure that you give them some space to breathe.